Okay, so we're going to just go over very briefly the neurobiological stress response. There are several key players that are involved in the stress response, and I want you to be familiar with these. Now, there are other ones that are involved, but these are the main players, and they include the amygdala, the hippocampus, the HPA axis, corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, adrenocotropin releasing hormone, or ACTH, adrenal glands, cortisol, and adrenaline. Okay, so first let's look at the amygdala. The amygdala is a little pea-sized structure in the brain that recognizes an external event as a stressor. So to do this, it actually confers with the hippocampus. The hippocampus is another structure in the brain that plays a big role in memory. And so when the amygdala reaches out to the hippocampus looks back in its whole, kind of like its whole filing cabinet of images and of memories. And along with the amygdala, they decide whether something is a stressor. For instance, if you see a bear, most of us think back and go, okay, we know we've learned somewhere that a bear needs to be scary. We need to be afraid of a bear. A 2-year-old might not have that same image in its hippocampus. They might not have learned to be afraid of bears. So the hippocampus wouldn't have any memories or images. So in that sense, the amygdala might not recognize it as a stressor. However, for most of us as adults, we would recognize a bear. The amygdala would say, that's a stressor. So what happens then is the amygdala is going to reach out to other areas of the brain. So when the amygdala says, yes, that's a stressor, it's going to send out the signal to the HPA axis. So the first part of the HPA axis that the amygdala reaches out to is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is somewhat like a command center or a military sergeant that immobilizes other parts of the brain and body. So the hypothalamus sends out a little chemical to the pituitary gland to say, hey, we need to get going. We've got a stressor we have to face. The pituitary gland then sends out a hormone called ACTH that travels down to the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands sit atop of our kidneys, and they release hormones called cortisol and adrenaline. Now, epinephrine is the neurotransmitter version of adrenaline. So just remember, when you hear epinephrine and adrenaline, they basically mean the same things. But adrenaline is really the hormone version, and that's what's released from the adrenal glands, contrary to what you see in this image. So cortisol and adrenaline are released from those adrenal glands, and they travel to other parts of the body, to the receptor sites, where they activate and immobilize different parts of the body to face the stressor. For instance, our heart starts beating fast, we start sweating, we go into what's called a fight or flight response. Okay, let's back up for just a minute and take a look at the adrenal glands. So we're looking at our HPA axis. Remember the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and then the adrenal glands. So let's zoom in on the adrenal glands. Remember, these sit atop the kidneys, and they're slightly different in size and shape, just a little bit, but each are made up of an outside shell or layer called the adrenal cortex and a middle piece called the adrenal medulla. The stress hormone, cortisol, which is a glucocorticoid, is released from the adrenal cortex, or that outer layer, while adrenaline is released from the middle of the adrenal glands, called the medulla. So the really important point, though, is to remember that these two hormones are released from the adrenal gland during times of stress. The adrenal gland produces and releases all types of chemicals, but adrenaline and cortisol are the ones most commonly associated with the stress response. So let's just summarize this process, because it's really important that you're familiar with these basics of the stress response, because it really helps put everything together when we talk about stressors and trauma and even toxins from the environment. Okay, so remember, what happens is a stressor or an event occurs, and the amygdala, along with the hippocampus in the brain, determines, hey, is this a stressor? Should we go into action? Should we trigger the alarm? So if the amygdala says, yeah, let's do it. So then the amygdala will send a message to the HPA axis. And the first part of that HPA axis is the hypothalamus, which is in the brain. And the hypothalamus gathers the troops and sends a message to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is also in the brain, but the pituitary gland sends a message via a hormone called ACTH through the body to the adrenal glands, which sit right above the kidneys. And the adrenal glands release two hormones called adrenaline and cortisol, and they release those to the rest of the body, which activate the fight and flight response.